Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything related to language learning. My name is Vanessa, also known as Shiki in the community, and I am a language coach for Refold. Today, we are turning the podcast on its head, and the host has become the guest. I had the pleasure of interviewing Clayton himself, and we talked all about his experience managing the community, as well as getting deeper into his background with language learning. So, let's get into it. All right. We are here with a little bit of a switcheroo episode where the host is being interviewed, Clayton.
Hello.
Hello. So we're going to bamboozle the audience a little bit here. And you are actually going to be interviewed. And we're going to find out more about you. This is the Clayton George Pig lore episode of the Refold Podcast.
Would you believe it? This is actually one of the most requested episodes I get.
I 100% believe it. Because I am in that group of people who wants to know more about the pig.
All right. Well, this is your chance to get to know more about the pig.
I'm ready. I'm excited. So we can start off with who actually are you and what is your relationship with the Refold community?
So I am Clayton. I am the community manager at Refold. So nominally, I manage the Discord communities. But in practice, being that we're a small startup, I wear a lot of different hats. So I do the sport tickets in English and Spanish. I also do some coaching. Our primary coach is Vanessa. But I take a few clients, as does Ben and as does Ethan.
Yeah, you pretty much take everyone that is doing a language that is not Japanese, and I take all the ones who are doing Japanese.
Yep, that will change.
Yeah,
that'll change.
definitely. So, okay, so that brings me to the next question. How did you get into this position you're in with Refold? Getting hired and doing all these different things, working with clients in the community. Like, how did it happen?
Yeah, sure. So, funny story. I actually joined Refold when it dropped.
When it dropped?
So, like when it came out. So at that time, I had just gotten into immersion learning, and I was in a couple of like knockoff immersion learning servers that were unofficial, not part of MIA, not part of Refold, not part of anything else. And I joined on day one. I joined Refold Central, and I became an active member. And within about 3 months, I ended up getting moderated on Central. I think Bree and Cloudy might have pushed for that. And then, yeah, sometime down the road, Ethan was getting really, really busy. He couldn't manage all of the servers himself. So I ended up taking that. He interviewed me. We had an interview.
Okay.
And yeah, I became the quote unquote super admin for all the Discord servers. Yeah, the rest is history. So essentially, I just joined early on, which is probably a big part of it. Got my foot in the door early.
Right.
And then you know me, I'm sort of chronically online. So I was just a presence in the servers.
Yeah. So I'm curious what the servers were like at that time. Like, what was the atmosphere and culture? Because I got into it like a few months after.
Actually.
Really?
Yeah, the old Refold community was very different. So we didn't have like voice chats because Ethan didn't want to moderate them. A lot of the original moderation in the early days of Refold were actually people who were grandfathered in from Matt's server from MIA.
Right.
So they weren't really refolders, they were definitely immersion learners, definitely MIA people, but um, they definitely had an older school perspective on things, um, limited tooling on certain issues, uh, different ideas about healthy amounts of immersion to other activities. Um, yeah, they were really different, actually. Central was way more active, I think, as well
Okay.
in those days.
It seems very active now, so I can't really imagine how much more active it would have been.
Yeah, it was pretty active. It was a different time, really. It was different.
So, related to Refold is very much language learning. So, I want to know about your language learning history, your background. Like, what was the origin point? Where did it all start?
All right, let's get into it. So, um, I had 4 years of language education when I was in high school. So I went to two different high schools. My first high school, um, we had Spanish class, and it was very basic. I actually don't remember much about it. I remember that a couple of times a month we would get to watch The Simpsons in Spanish.
Oh, wow, what a treat.
Um, but it was not immersion learning. And I don't remember much. I remember by the end of the 2 years, I could count and I knew like basic like color adjectives and stuff. But that's about it. Then we ended up moving after those 2 years. And my second school offered French, German, Spanish, and Japanese. And me being a 16-year-old weeb, I was like, okay, let's do this. Let's get into Japanese. So for
Let's go.
Japanese, we used a combination of Pimsleur tapes for home practice, and we also used a textbook series called Japanese for Young People. So you Japanese learners out there may be aware of Japanese for Busy People. This is the same group of like textbook makers,
Okay.
but they aimed it at kids.
Okay. Well, how'd it go with Japanese? You talked about where you got with Spanish, but what was the experience like with Japanese with a different school and everything like that?
Yeah, so with Japanese, I think my final thing I did with Japanese when I left the school was I hand wrote a paper. Very simple. It was only actually a couple of sentences. My writing was just really big and clunky. And I was pretty confident, actually. Like I had been interviewed on it was like an early it was sort of like an early version of a podcast. It was sort of like it was internet radio, and there were not a whole bunch of listeners, maybe 60 people, but I had gotten in um, to this Japanese sort of proto podcast thing. And I was able to like stumble my way through basic like biographic information and stuff. And of course, Japanese people are very supportive. So at that
Right.
point, I thought I was awesome. I thought I was great. Um,
Was it something
and
that the school hosted? This proto podcast thing you're talking about, or was it
no, no,
something
no, it
else?
was not. So at the time, I played League of Legends, which
Mm,
did not yet have a Japanese server. Um, so there was a gaming group, um, and I realized they were Japanese. Um, and yeah, I became friends with them. We mostly played together in English, but one of them had sort of like an early podcast type thing, and I was on it.
okay, well that's neat. What else did you do with Japanese after that, or what happened after Japanese class was over?
Yeah, I didn't do much. I thought I was great at Japanese. I called myself a weeb, but I wasn't really a weeb, but I was like kind of like a weeb light. Like I definitely liked anime, but it wasn't a huge part of my life. And what I did like was very surface level pop shonen type stuff. So I ended up not doing much. Shortly after I graduated high school, my mother passed away. And that kind of set my life back a couple of years. Um,
Hmm.
and I did initially have plans to use Japanese, but those did not come to fruition. Where I'm from, we have Toyota is one of our biggest employers. So, I'm from Kentucky,
Hmm.
and we've got Toyota, and we've also got Toyota with a D, like Toyotetsu, some sort of iron manufacturing thing. So there's a lot of Japanese industry.
Huh.
Um,
Okay.
and I think I went to I think I met a few people. Um, uh, there was like a, what do they call it? Multi intercultural festival. I don't know. I went to a couple of those and like did things. But that was about the end of my Japanese journey there. When I graduated high school, I kind of dropped it and I didn't do anything with it. Um, and at some point, I would revisit it, and I was like, I actually don't understand anything. I don't know how I thought it was so good. But it's easy to feel really good when you're a 16-year-old from the middle of nowhere, right? You got
Right.
that 16-year-old confidence.
Hmm. And classes are also very accommodating, and your classmates and teachers and um, all of that.
Yeah, I certainly had my ego stroked by the people around me.
So then, what happened after Japanese? I know you got more languages in you.
Yeah, so at some point, I watched a movie called White Wedding, and it was it's my first exposure to a language called Afrikaans. Um, so White Wedding is mostly in English. I'd say like 99% of it's in English. It's a South African comedy. It came on TV late at night one night, and yeah, the main character, he goes on some sort of crazy journey related to his marriage. I totally forget why. I don't actually remember. I just remember it was a comedy. But at one point, um, the main character is not a white South African. Um, I'm not sure if he was like Kate Malay or if he was Zulu or Hosa or something. But he was not a white South African, and he ends up in this little backwoods village. I think their car breaks down, and I think they have like an Irish tourist hitchhiker. I forget. It was weird, but they ended up at this little bar, and sort of like a country bar, real hick type people, and he sits down to like this sort of like semi-racist dude, but then they get drunk together and then they start singing in Afrikaans these sort of like semi-patriotic songs, um, and they become friends. And I don't know, I got introduced to Afrikaans through the movie called White Wedding. Um, and I realized South Africa has a lot in common with the American South.
Oh,
Um,
really?
the culture is very similar in a lot of ways. Yeah, I would say so. The settler colonialism history is very similar. The
Gotcha.
farming. If you ever listen to like modern Afrikaans music, it sounds like American country music just in Afrikaans.
I have
Um,
not. That's new to me.
yeah, so
But
I went to a
Afrikaans sounds like
place.
a cool language.
Yeah, so one of the things that convinced me to go for Afrikaans was that I sort of like kind of failed at Japanese. And Afrikaans only has like 8 irregular verbs. It has no gender. Um, it's a contact language. I don't want to call it a Creole because that's up in the air, but it's a contact language. So
And it's
um,
very close to English, right? That's like a major thing.
yeah, it's close to English in that like they're both West Germanic languages. but it's sort of like a simplified and regularized version of Dutch.
Right.
So Dutch, for whatever reason, has this tendency to simplify when it goes overseas. So Dutch used to be spoken in North America. New Netherland was a place. Like New York used to be New Amsterdam.
Huh. Okay.
And there was like a war, and then like the English traded Suriname for New York and New Jersey and stuff. Don't really know the details. But up until like the 1800s, the Sojourner Weaver woman,
Yes, Sigourney Weaver.
or what's her name? No, not Sojourner Weaver. What is her name? Sojourn. She's the "Ain't I a Woman" speech. Have you ever heard
I'm
that?
not sure.
"Ain't I a Woman"? Give me a sec. What is her name? Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is her name.
Okay.
She was like a black woman who did a speech about like being a woman and having rights.
Mm-hmm.
Well, her first language was Dutch, and
Yeah.
to this day, Dutch is the only language spoken as the first language by a U.S. president other than English. So Martin van Buren, for example, spoke Dutch. So
Interesting.
yeah, Dutch and Afrikaans is not alone here. If you look at Jersey Dutch, if you look at Albany Dutch, if you look at Mohawk Dutch, because it was also spoken by like a mixed group of like Mohawk Indians, African Americans, and Dutch people.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those changes happen. The gender system in Dutch is not very clear. It's very opaque. So Afrikaans lost its gender. It doesn't really conjugate verbs for person. So it's sort of like I go, you go, we go, they go, he go. And yeah, it was very appealing to me, this sort of simple language.
Gotcha.
And I went for it. I bought books ordered them straight from South Africa. Kalahari.net, I think, was the website. It's no longer a website. It's been changed. I watched what I could. I went through this textbook, and I ended up finding that a couple of sitcoms that I really liked. So Vet Cook Place and Orkney Snorkney were the two sitcoms that I binge watched. I really found them funny. I don't know why. And I could not get into South African soap operas. I tried. There's one called Seventh Lane. And yeah, that was sort of my contact with Afrikaans. I also got Afrikaans is really good punk music.
Oh, really?
Yes. So I got into like FBK, Finco Cartel, all the music. And that was sort of my Afrikaans journey. I'm not super good at Afrikaans. I can still read stuff in it. Like they added it to Link recently, and I do pretty okay. Like I can make but I don't think that I wouldn't call myself a speaker, but it's there in hiding in my brain.
So I know that we're not through your language history yet, but you said that you wouldn't say that you speak Afrikaans. So like, what languages would you say that you speak?
I always tell people English.
Humble.
It's a matter of realism and pragmatism, I think when you dabble like I have, you sort of sacrifice a certain level of depth. Even in my strongest languages, I'm still probably weaker than some of the other team. So, I use Spanish daily for work.
Right.
And I've, I lived in Mexico for a while. But my command is not as strong I think, as some of the other people on the team who do speak Spanish.
I mean, it's like a scale, right? Like, thinking about the common European framework, where would you say you are with Spanish on that scale?
Geez, I don't know. That's tough. That's tough. I don't know with the CEFR where I would be. I think that I'm Refold stage 2C, like a hard 2C for sure.
Okay. So maybe like B1 or so on the scale.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not super confident in my ability to self-rate.
Well, what about your other
But
languages? So what happened after Afrikaans?
yeah, so Afrikaans, obviously did not. Never ended up going to South Africa or Namibia or anything. I flirted with the idea of going to Suriname in South America and doing Dutch, but yeah, at some point I kind of settled on Spanish, and I studied Spanish. I did a course called Platicamos, which was sort of an old style FSI military type course where you listen and repeat. I also did something called Learning Spanish Like Crazy, which is sort of like a Pimsleur style course. I was not an immersion learner at this time. I did some immersion learning with Afrikaans, totally by accident, because I was like, hey, these sitcoms are funny and I understand them. I didn't actually like seek it out, and it was not a part of my routine. And Platicamos had this issue where it didn't teach you the T form, the tu form of words. So for a long time, I was really weak. I could only conjugate politely.
Yeah, so everything was usted?
Correct.
Mm.
And yeah, I did Spanish, and at some point I quit my job and I moved to Mexico. And yeah, I still, even when I got to Mexico, was not a total immersion learner. So I made one of the cardinal sort of mistakes that fresh expats make, is I instantly found an English speaking friend group and hung
The
out with
English
them.
bubble.
And I got sort of to an English bubble in Mexico City. So yeah, I think it was probably 3 or 4 years after I first started learning Spanish that I actually read my first book in Spanish.
So you started doing immersion learning on purpose with Spanish.
Yeah, so I got into immersion learning. Not too long before Refold came into being.
Okay.
But I hadn't totally settled on Spanish. But I think I got Link, and my first content that I read in Spanish was The Little Prince. And that was sort of like my first time actually doing immersion learning with Spanish. Yeah.
So how was it? Like, how did you feel doing immersion learning purposefully instead of accidentally? What was your experience like?
So it was still kind of haphazard. It was nice. It was nice. I mean,
You didn't feel frustrated?
I don't think so. Not with Spanish, no.
Okay. It's kind of a common issue when people first start getting into immersion learning, that they feel frustrated at the beginning because, of course, they don't understand anything. That's part of the process. So I'm wondering, like, it was pretty smooth for you then.
Yeah, I think so. I think somebody with a good command of cognates, and somebody who's been through like a grammar course type thing that I went through, where I had verbal conjugations drilled into my head, I don't think they would struggle getting into immersion learning. I've seen it myself. I've seen a couple of clients come in with like, some people like in the West Coast, for example, they graduate, they take our vocab test and they score like 3,000 vocab. I'm like, okay, that's a decent amount. They only need
Mm-hmm.
a little boost to get to like 5,000 and start having conversations. So I definitely think it's doable. In Spanish, I think going into it with a different language, where as Americans we do tend to have this education in Spanish.
Yeah.
We do tend to have contact with it. It's a little bit different than going into it with like, like, oh, I'm going to be learning Ojibwe, and then you're not from an Ojibwe reservation. You don't have contact with it. It's going to be a lot different.
Mm-hmm. So then you're fluent in Spanish, right? Like what happened after that? Because it's not the end of the language story, right?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent in Spanish. I can use it conversationally, but there are still times I feel frustrated and I don't feel like I can actually say what I want to say easily. And every now and then I'll get a support ticket on the site, and I'm like, I know what you're wanting, and I'm trying to explain this to you, and it can be quite difficult giving instructions that you haven't had to give before in a new language. But yeah, so we skipped around a bit. I ended up going to Asia after leaving Mexico. I spent some time in Taiwan, and then eventually the Philippines. And my mindset with the Philippines was, okay, I liked Mexico. Philippines is Asian Mexico. It's not. That is totally wrong. It's very much a Southeast Asian country. The culture is very different. The only thing they share in common are Hispanic names and being Catholic. But I did have a certain confidence with my language abilities after having done sort of this speed run of Spanish. So I buckled down and I bought a textbook series thing. At the time it was a textbook, now it's a web app called Glossica. I did 2 hours of Filipino study every single day. And then after I sort of went through Glossica, I went through a textbook. I can't remember. I think it was by Yale. It was really expensive, really annoying, and it was sort of a Filipino version of Platicamos, sort of the audiolingual listen and repeat method.
Gotcha.
And the Philippines has 185 different languages. It's a very linguistically diverse country. Yes.
My God.
So that was a shock. It was very different. And one thing you quickly learn with Filipino is that most speakers are L2 speakers. So it's sort of like learning English in Europe. People in Poland and people in Spain might be able to talk to each other in English, but it's not really their native language. And they speak it to varying degrees of fluency and so on and so forth.
Okay. So it's kind of like India, where they speak like Hindi or something, and also like Indian English, right?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I guess there's definitely Filipino English there as well. But I would compare its status to like a lingua franca. Most Filipinos can speak Filipino, even if they're not native. And their ability with the language is going to vary. But back to the language learning. Around the time I got into Link, and I started doing it with Spanish and stuff, I also read my first book in Filipino. I can't find it anymore. The author, she sold her rights, so it was on Wattpad, which is sort of like a web fiction, internet fiction, fanfic site. and I think she got grabbed by like one of these um, predatory companies that give you a contract and then they don't actually pay you very much, but they can get the rights to the story.
Mm.
And the story disappeared. I didn't have it backed up because at the time I was super illiterate. I didn't know about like Caliber and downloading stuff from these sites. But yeah, I think it took me 2 years to actually read my first book in Filipino, which is incredibly slow when we talk about the modern days with refolders, right? Refolders
Mm-hmm.
will go and they'll do their 1K deck, or maybe they'll do a 2K deck, and then they'll jump into like manga and graded readers, and they're at it in just a few months. Versus with me, it took a few years.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Why do I think it took so long? Because I wasn't an immersion learner. There was no refold
Ah,
back then. I wasn't tied
okay,
into
so
the
you
community.
still were not immersion pilled.
Correct. Like I had come to accept immersion learning as a tool, but it was not the bread and butter of what I was doing. I was still like,
Gotcha.
um, younger me had a lot more energy. I was a lot more Genki. I I would do Anki for hours a day.
Ah,
You know, a 2 hour day of Anki was nothing for me back a couple of years ago.
oh, that's terrifying.
Um, so the bread and butter of what I did was I still output a whole bunch. I was on Discord a whole bunch, Hello Talk. I even met a roommate from one of these apps, one of these Hello Talk tandem type apps. Um, and my what I did was essentially Anki at that point, Anki and output.
Oh my goodness. Anki and output.
Hello.
So you did Filipino for a while, and then what happened after that? I like knowing you, I know that you are a dabbler. So what else did you dabble in?
Geez, at some point, I dabbled in Indonesian. This was before being immersion build. I
Yeah.
think I think I signed up for a University of Hawaii course. It was self-paced. Um, and they gave you like a trial for a month or 2 months or something for like $5 versus buying the whole course for like forever, which would cost a couple like $100 or $200. So I just binged the course. I did hours and hours of Indonesian every single day so that I would only have to pay $5, not have to pay a couple hundred.
Mm.
Um, so it's called the Indonesian Way, DIW. It's a very famous course. And actually, it's not that bad for like a traditional course. I think it's okay. Um, but again, it was just a lot of Anki. I had the Anki for the textbook slash course. Did a whole bunch of Anki. Um, and this is sort of near the point where I started learning about immersion learning. But it was
So how'd
still,
you learn
again, just a
about it?
very marginal thing. I had a friend. I had a friend slash a coworker, and he was a Japanese learner,
Of course. Of course it was a
and
Japanese learner.
yeah, he was sort of a follower of Matt and Matt versus Japan and all that stuff.
Mm.
Um, and he'd gotten quite good at Japanese, so he, yeah, he and I shared a mutual love of language learning. But again, our approaches were very different, right? He was sort of very old school AJAP. And later he got into Matt and Matt versus Japan. But yeah, my coworker sort of started opening my eyes to immersion learning.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I didn't fully understand immersion learning until Refold. I want to make that clear. Like, I knew about it, and like suddenly it's like, okay, you can do some reading, you can do some listening, but it was still not the core of my method at that time. Um, I think it probably took a while for me actually, like for Refold to be a thing and for me to be in the community, for me to actually say, I get it. Immersion learning is the bread and butter. And then
Mm-hmm.
like things like Anki and grammar references are the dessert. They're not the main course.
Right. So, speaking of the community, what is it like managing the community? Like, what do you feel is the vibe in the community?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about Refold, and I'm not sure I would have done this if I were Ethan, is that Refold's community is sort of like a confederation, and that each community is slightly independent from the rest of the community.
Right.
So each server is sort of semi-autonomous. The Japanese community, the Japanese learning community is different from the Mandarin learning community, different from the Korean learning community, different from the Spanish learning community.
Right.
So that's one interesting thing, is that in some communities I have a much more direct role because they may not have the most active moderation team or or admin. Whereas in other servers, I feel like I'm kind of like a guest. I feel like I'm one of those colonial governors sent from old England to one of the colonies in the New World. Like, I'm
Yeah.
here, you technically have to listen to me, but I'm not really from the community. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's very interesting because it leads to some very interesting dynamics among the communities, and like
Mm-hmm.
making changes and doing things. And yeah, each community is totally unique. The French server, for example, very, very European heavy. Lots of people from Europe. Whereas I feel like a lot of other servers are very North American heavy. And the Spanish community is fully bilingual. So a lot of people there are actually English learners. So they're people from Latin America. So yeah, it's interesting. As I've worn more hats at Refold, I do less stuff with the community, and I'm thankful to have a good group of people running the servers. I think
Mm-hmm.
I've been able to delegate a lot of my former tasks with managing the servers to other people, and that's been nice. But I do sometimes miss the old days of constantly being in the thick of community management.
Yeah. So it was like a big aspect of your job, like you said, but not so much now. So what are your favorite aspects of your job with Refold then?
Geez, what are my favorite aspects? So I really enjoy the podcast. I
Mm-hmm.
really enjoy the coaching, because the coaching, I feel like my skills, having taught English as a second language for 5 years, transfer. Not just like being a specific teacher, like a specific language teacher, but I feel like when I first started teaching, despite being a huge language nerd, I was an awful teacher. Teaching is very much a skill,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
that skill transferred. So I feel pretty comfortable doing it. Occasionally, I get involved in projects. So we release the Teach Yourself a Language course, and I got to write a
Mm-hmm.
couple of the lessons. So even though Ben was the one who presented those lessons, I wrote a few of them, which is nice.
Yeah.
And I know that you are not a fan of like the quick start guide for like Japanese, but I put together every single quick start guide, and
Mm-hmm.
they're not where I wanted them to be. We never added like the CSS or whatever to give like tables. Like, I wish I could reformat them, but I made all of the quick start guides. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And I did the bulk of a very large database that we're currently working on for content. So the idea is that most of the major languages, we have content for every step of the way, right? Pronunciation, writing system, so on and so forth. And that sort of stuff is fun. I would say making content, making guides, coaching.
Yeah. There are a couple of people in the Refold team who are kind of like the face of things, but with a lot of projects, there are a lot of hands involved in it. Like the course that was just released, the Teach Yourself a Language course, the database. You wrote a lot of the lessons and everything, and from the beginning, it was pretty much the whole team putting together the structure of what the course would look like for every day. And it's just really cool how we all just come together and make these things.
Yeah, it's an engine where like each part of the engine is required to make the engine function.
Right.
If you lose a part, then the whole thing doesn't work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that definitely like content creation and more of the educational side. I recently have started writing blog posts again, and I've got a couple of drafts, educational drafts. So I've got one about cognates in general, and I've got one that's essentially a guide for going from English to Spanish. So, learning how to harness the powers of cognates. And I think I put together put together like a German guide. I like putting together guides. The talking about language and teaching how to learn it. That's definitely my favorite part.
Yeah.
I do support tickets, but it's not like, hey, I want to be customer service, right? It's sort of like that's a tangible thing that I do. So definitely things directly related to language are what I like. Talking about it, working with it, helping people with it. Those are my favorite things to do.
Yeah, I think both of us really enjoy giving advice and helping learners out. So you like to create content, educational content to help learners. What is some advice you like to give to learners? And I also want to know, like, if you only could give a new learner, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Consistency over intensity would be my mantra. I think for most people, spending an hour a day over a long period is more realistic than spending 8 hours a day over a short period. Yeah, if I could only give one piece of advice, it would be the tortoise, not the hare.
Right. And then
other pieces of advice I like to give is that we don't learn words in Anki. Anki is just a priming tool. So words are not trapped in Anki. If you failed the card 5 times in Anki, it's okay. You might learn it in the wild. Do your lookups. That'll be fine. Don't obsess over Anki. Don't overdo Anki. Would be another piece of advice.
Yeah, that is something I notice with a lot of people. It's like when they fail Anki cards, it feels really bad. And I can't blame them for feeling bad because Anki is designed to show you things you're about to forget. And that feels bad, right? But even if you failed every card in Anki in your study session one day, that does not like doom you. You will still learn the language. Like Anki is not a test, and it's not an indication of what your success will look like, right? In language.
For sure. It's one of those things where Anki is sort of counterintuitive. My rough understanding of Anki is that the optimal pass rate is actually somewhere like 75 or 80%. which does not feel as good as like passing 100% of your cards. But if you're passing 100% of your cards, it means you're over reviewing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Anki it's tricky. It's tricky because you either love it or you hate it, and neither one is necessarily a good thing to do. You don't want to hate it. You don't want to love it. It's just a tool. And it's not the only tool, right? Um, Here lately, I've seen with at least the coaching clients, a greater acceptance of other SRS, right? So I'm seeing
Mm-hmm.
people use like Unpro for Japanese grammar. I'm seeing people use Memrise for Spanish and French, uh, or not Memrise, Closemaster. So
Yeah.
I think for the Chinese learners, Hack Chinese is quite popular. So there are, it's not the be all end all SRS either. You can also do other SRS.
All right. I want to get into some more spicy questions.
Icy questions. Oh no.
So earlier we talked about dabbling. And I think at least in like an old school immersion learner's mindset, dabblers are kind of like lower on the totem pole, if that makes sense. Like a lot of old school learners don't really have a good opinion of dabblers. So I'm wondering how you feel about that, what your experience was like as a dabbler, and how you feel about it, and what you would say to people who have that kind of view on dabblers.
That's tough to answer. Because certainly there are some trade-offs of dabbling and not dabbling. So if you don't dabble and you focus, you can take one language to a very high level. Um, and dabbling, you often do not take your languages to such a high level. But dabblers do get some metalinguistic awareness. So one thing that I see a whole bunch in the community is like language X has feature Y. It's so special. That's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
People are just super, super, super unaware of the reality of language. People are like, oh, this is a tonal language. Well, a very slight majority of the world's languages do have tone, and not only is their lexical tone, there's also grammatical tone, especially in Africa. And like people are like, oh, there's gender and noun classes. It's like, okay, well, this language has 15 noun classes. What do you want? So people are just super duper unaware of language as a whole. They're unaware of
Yeah.
what features are actually rare. They're unaware of things. And I think to some extent, dabbling can give you a lot of metalinguistic awareness. Um, but
Yeah.
I don't think there's any doubt that dabblers do not get as far as people who focus. But that's okay. It's okay. People have different goals. For some people, anything less than native like is not enough. For other people, being conversational is enough, and that's fine too.
Mm-hmm. So, being a dabbler, you have interest in a lot of languages. So, I'm wondering if we're pretending that time and money is not an issue. How many languages would you want to be fluent in if you could just magically take a pill and be fluent in a bunch of languages? Like, would you do that? And which ones would you want to be fluent in? Like, B2 or
Oh,
higher
gee.
on the scale?
I cannot answer that question. But if we were to pose it as if I had like unlimited money and did not have to work, 40 hours a week or whatever, I would probably spend that time learning languages for sure.
So you wouldn't
And for
just
which
take the magic
languages,
fluency.
I'm not sure. I couldn't answer that.
You would still want to work at it. Like you wouldn't just take the magic pill.
I don't know. I don't know if I would take the easy way.
All right. We're still going to work at it. I got you. So, from knowing you, it sounds like your strongest languages are Spanish and Filipino or Tagalog, right? Is that accurate?
That is accurate. Mhm.
So, do you feel like you have reached a high proficiency in any language, and do you want to, or does that just not align with your personal goals?
So at this point, I would like to take my Spanish to the next level. Um, I've been listening to Tinder is the Flesh, which is a sort of horror dystopian novel. It's originally a Spanish novel. It's originally Argentinian. Um, so professionally, there's no doubt that as an American, um, Spanish is super useful. So I do want to
Mhm.
further improve my Spanish. With Filipino, it feels like I'm at the point where I'm just learning vocab that a lot of people don't use. It's a lot of words that are only existent in um, liturgical text or historical documents. Um, so I think I have different goals because at the end of the day, languages are tools.
Mhm.
And the reality of the situation is that in some countries, the majority language is not used in all domains. If you go to Jamaica, people on the street are speaking patois, but if you go to like a university, people are not speaking English. Um, if you go to India, same deal. You've got people speaking a variety of regional languages, but then the a lot of domains are going to be in English. Um, so in a way, it's hard to compare. It's hard to compare some languages and some goals. You know, people in the Philippines use English for certain things instead of using a different language, and that's just a fact. So I would say that I have different goals for my Spanish and my Filipino. I think my Filipino is fine because the reality is that you're not going to be using it for business deals, right? Whereas
Gotcha.
in Spanish, somebody using Spanish from all levels of society, from street vendors to university educated people, it's going to be Spanish. So I would say I have different goals for the languages.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you have a very high level in Filipino. So, random question. If you were just hit over the head and you forgot all your other languages, like, what would your life be like with just Filipino?
That would be very difficult given that I work with Refold in English. Um, and, actually, once upon a time, we did have a team. We had a marketing team from the Philippines. And even
Mhm.
then, they all worked in English. So
Mhm.
again, it's very hard. It would be very hard, I think. Um, but certainly, if I just only surrounded myself with Filipino speakers, I could probably do just fine, I would say.
Okay. All right.
But
Um
yeah, definitely Refold would not make that switch.
we're all going to learn Filipino instead of Spanish. All right. So, I feel like I have saved the best question for last. At least for me, the one that I want to know about the most is because I like spicy takes. So, um what would you say is your most controversial language opinion?
Could you narrow that down for me?
Let me
Controversial in what
see.
way?
So something that probably, I guess, an unpopular opinion about language learning, something that the community would probably think is a little bit blasphemous, maybe.
Oh man. Okay. Japanese could reform its spelling to not use kanji if it wanted to.
No!
Korea has done it with Korean. So don't
That's
say, oh, but
true.
the kanji compounds, so on and so forth. I think it's doable. The same goes for the Sinitic languages. I think Mandarin could be written in a Roman script if it wanted to be. I'm not saying pinyin is the solution there, but yeah, I don't think that that's a popular opinion. But I will stand by that. We've got Vietnamese and we've got Korean as examples of languages that have sort of,
Mm,
you know, I don't want to say cast off the shackles of xenograms, but cast off the shackles of xenograms. Um, I'm not a super huge fan. Not a super huge fan, and yeah, in an alternate reality, I think these languages would be written in different scripts.
I don't know. I think a language that basically uses the equivalent of emojis for words is pretty cool.
It is pretty cool, and certainly, a sort of semi-phonetic alphabet type thing like English uses is not always the best answer. But I do think there's a large mental. I think different scripts have different levels of mental burden. Um,
Right.
and I would imagine that Sinogram, so kanji and Hansa and Hansha are high up there. I don't have any evidence to back this up. I'm just guessing. I could be totally wrong.
All right. Well, of course, me being a Japanese learner, you had to have an unpopular opinion about Japanese in my presence. But it's okay. I know that there are some people that will probably listen to this and will probably be very upset, but that's okay. We're all friends here. Um, yeah, so I guess that pretty much wraps it up. Um, I know that I very much enjoyed learning more about Clayton, the George Pig himself, the community manager of Refold, and I know that a lot of people listening to this will also enjoy it.
All right, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was great.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.